and this is going to be your introduction to ancient Maya graffiti. So we're looking at a case study within Mesoamerican themes that you have all chosen. And the themes that will be kind of represented in this lecture are going to be images of the ruler, architectural sculpture, looking at handheld objects, and also a relationship that we're going to be seeing with ancient Maya graffiti to painted manuscripts and murals. Many of these themes are going to be very clear to you in this lecture, whereas sort of the painted manuscripts and murals will be a little less clear. And I'll have another lecture that kind of looks at the painted manuscripts and the murals. But basically, I wanted you to think about this lecture from a perspective where you are considering these larger questions of interpreting ancient Maya art and imagery. We are going to be looking at graffiti from the ancient city of Tikal, which is in the Petén region of Guatemala. And I titled this introductory lecture, A Witness to History, because in my research, I have found that so much of graffiti in general, but graffiti in particular at the ancient site of Tikal, is a witness to lived experiences. These artists or graffitiists are depicting scenes that they lived, that they witnessed, that they saw. So graffiti from this perspective, and I'm talking from the global, universal perspective, can be explored by scholars as a witness, a sketch, an unedited interpretation of life. And that is actually quite valuable for society, to be able to look at and read an unedited version of life, a mini biography or autobiography of an event or of a person or of a population. So we are not going to get into sort of the political issues surrounding graffiti, but I want you to perhaps change your perspective of graffiti or allow yourself to ask new questions of this medium. And this will be an example of how you can do that. What you see before you is a representation of a graffiti from an interior space at the site of Tikal. And it is sketchy. There's not a real interest in spatial relations. There is not an interest in using a ground line or in composition. And for Maya scholars, these are attributes that are quite off-putting for many art historians who deal with the Maya, because the Maya created what we could say as very skilled and very lovely depictions of rulers, of nature. They created these really extraordinary building programs. So this image is has been described as childlike or doodling, or the representations of actual children or people who have taken hallucinogens and are creating sort of quote-unquote nonsense pictures. But I have looked at these works, and I believe there's something that's going on that is very, very subtle, yet very intelligent. And we are looking at images of, again, lived experience. And they may have been influenced by children. They may have been influenced by hallucinogenics, but they also may have been influenced by the need to express themselves and the need to subvert the official doctrinaire propagandistic voice of a select group of Maya. So what we are also looking at with this imagery is politics and the voice of a select group that may not agree with the ruler, and they are in considerable danger expressing this sentiment, and they also are elites themselves. Many anthropologists call this type of communication horizontal propaganda, And this is something that came out of the work of a woman named Joyce Marcus. And she was talking about it in terms of writing, ancient writing, where propaganda is going, instead of top bottom, it is horizontal, meaning people who have similar classes are trying to convince each other of an idea or of an opinion. And I think that that is an interpretation that needs more research when it is used with graffiti, but it is something that is worth kind of at least mentioning in this introductory comments. In graffiti lecture number 2, you're going to be looking more closely at this ruler and protector theme, which is a trope in Maya art. A trope is an idea that is depicted in imagery. And we are going to be borrowing words like trope, T-R-O-P-E, and motif, M-O-T-I-F, from literature, because we are looking at imagery as a text, like you would see a written text and reading Shakespeare. Here we are looking at a visual text that gives us continuous and kind of a quote-unquote static idea, which is this ruler and protector theme. The ruler and protector theme can be depicted in many ways, but characteristics are similar, if not the same, meaning the dominant characteristics are a large, over life scale protector figure who is either an animal or a human or an anthropomorphized animal. The second component would be a seated individual who is much smaller than that protector figure. Both figures look in the same direction, and they are both placed in a context of temporary architecture. Architecture that can be dismantled easily, that is used for ceremonial purposes. Both figures in this trope are dressed elaborately. In the graffiti that you see on the right side in Mahler's room, there are some differences from the lintel graffiti, but in general, this trope is pretty recognizable. The context of this lintel and this very official and canonical trope of the ruler and the protector theme is the superstructure shrine of Temple 1. The superstructure shrine of Temple 1 is a dark place, and a lintel is one of the very, very important structural supporting elements of this building and of the interior architecture of Maya structures. You can see a lintel at the very top of the staircase and the doorway leading into the superstructure. A lintel is this crossbar, horizontal beam that supports the roof. And in Maya architectural sculpture, as in many, many cultures globally, they carved on the inside of the lintels. They used the lintel itself as a surface for architectural sculpture. And also they used very, very wide lintels that helped to create a larger surface for sculptural programs. In the case of the ancient Maya, they had about 4 or 5 beams that, when put together, created one large ceiling, one large lintel, and also thus one large sculptural program. And that is what you see drawn on the right side of this slide. Here is a breakdown of the imagery from this lintel. It's kind of sometimes hard to see because there's so much line and detail and different textures of the line. And you have the face of this supernatural being. We have identified him as a jaguar. He has a jaguar and feline attributes: the snarl, the nose, his extended claws, the spots, his teeth. And lower, we have the image of the ruler who is seated. You can look at the different sort of open spaces in the decoration, and that gives you kind of where his body is, his thigh, his leg, his arm, his hands, and his face. But he is almost taken over by the costume of his office, which would be ruler of Tikal. Pay attention to the size and the extensive nature of his headdress. He is wearing his identity. If he were to be nude or naked, his identity would be much harder to read because he would look like a Maya elite individual. Here, he is not just a Maya elite individual, he is the ruler. Again, our comparison between the room 8 west wall graffiti and the lintel 3 doorway carving is a little less detail in the graffiti. That is partly due to the technique and the medium. The medium is quickly incised into a lime white stucco wall. It takes considerable strength to be able to incise in that. Most likely they used maybe a piece of obsidian stone or other very sharp stone. But the detail is lacking because it is very hard to put a great deal of detail into stucco without it becoming kind of a muddy image. The stucco is soft, whereas the wood, the sapodilla wood that is used for these lintels is very, very hard. And they were able to create extraordinarily deep, crisp, and very complex imagery. This is a slide from an interior at the site of Washoktun, which is another elite or a Maya city. This is an elite building, and just like the superstructure shrine from Temple 1, we're looking at a very dark space. However, because this is inside of a range-style building, it has multiple doorways, multiple openings, which give the space some light. But I wanted you to get a sense of the interior spaces of these structures. They are high in terms of the ceiling height, very high. They have these lintels, and you can see this wooden lintel that is over the doorway, and they are painted on the inside with white stucco, which does reflect light and does provide some light from which to see where you're sitting, to see your partner or your guest, and to see images on the walls. This is an exterior shot of Mahler's Palace. And as I mentioned to you before, this is a range-style structure. Mahler's Palace is unique because it does have a second story, not very common in these structures. And that second story may denote the fact that this is a very prominent elite person that spent time in this building. I don't know if I would say the king lived here, but I would say that a very, very prominent individual was associated with this sanctuary or this space. The room where we will be spending our time is at the far right side, and this is a room. It is called Room 9, and it is a space that is dappled with light. It has shadows, it has lights, it has spaces where one could sit. There are built-in benches. They are also called thrones. And this is a very comfortable location. However, Maya elites, like everyone else among the Maya people, may have lived in spaces, wattle and thatch temporary architecture outside, because it is comfortable to sit and lounge in these spaces and these stucco spaces, but spending a great deal of time there may have been difficult because of the heat and the lack of circulation, although they did try their hardest to create a very open space within an interior structure. In addition, this building, Mahler's Palace, faces Court 2, which is a small court within the Central Acropolis. And the Central Acropolis is a construction program populated by these range structures that housed and were sanctuaries for elites. The Central Acropolis is adjacent to the ceremonial core of Tikal. This is another example of graffiti from another site in another building. It's the site of La Blanca, which is also in Guatemala. And the site of La Blanca has enjoyed a lot of scholarship documenting and interpreting graffiti. The site of Tikal has not had as much scholarship documenting and interpreting graffiti. And in fact, Tikal has more graffiti, but because Tikal has such extraordinary architectural sculpture and burials and architectural in general, that has been the thrust of scholarship. At La Blanca, they're really looking at the graffiti. And so you have a cutaway view of a room at La Blanca that is stuccoed, and it has to scale where this graffiti is located. In general, the locations of graffitis on the wall in these rooms is life-size. For an average Maya and for a human being in the 21st century, we can read these images. They are placed on the wall in such a way that we want to see them. They are not difficult to see or to read. They are at eye level or a little below eye level, but they're not in odd, secretive spaces. They are available for us to see without straining our bodies. Here you have on the right side a detail of that graffiti. And it appears to be an image that shows people in ceremonial dress, perhaps within a ceremonial context, interacting with one another in a relatively casual way. We are not looking at a stiff presentation of a ruler encrusted with the symbols of his office. We are looking at people who are in casual poses and in casual gestures. In addition, they are wearing clothing that is of an elite nature, but it is a clothing they can easily move about. And it is clothing that makes sense for when you are in a very, very hot environment. It's not heavy clothing. At the very bottom of this graffiti image, you see a person playing an instrument, blowing into a horn. At the lower left, you have a person who is on their knees, and they seem to be looking towards this event that is happening in the upper right. If you look closely, although it is damaged, it seems as though the person has their arms folded across their chest. If you look at the figure in the upper right, that person also has one arm folded over their chest. So we are looking at shared depictions of human posture, hands folded over chest. Those who study a lot of the Maya have recognized this gesture as a way of greeting, but also as a way of an elite figure speaking to and talking to another person. In the vignette in the upper right-hand corner, you have an individual kneeling and perhaps giving supplication, giving respect to that person seated above them. So we are looking at a ceremony or a meeting of elites or a meeting of an elite and an ambassador from another city, but we're looking at people interacting with one another in a closed space, perhaps inside of one of these palaces. And I wanted you to train your eye one more time to look at that elite figure who is in the upper right. He is seated. He very well may be likely to be seated on one of these thrones built into the walls of these interior rooms. Here is a photo of a graffiti face and a tourist's face. And I put this here because I wanted you to see the actual close-up of the wall as they are today, a close-up of a graffiti as they look today, if they've been cleaned, and a sense of the size, the scale, and the line of this graffiti. we're looking at graffiti that is not life-size, but it is in some ways large enough to really look at and appreciate. Also, the graffiti that you see has been damaged by this mold or growth, this organic growth that is situating itself in these rooms. It's mossy, it's like algae, it kind of has an odor to it. It is green and slimy, like algae. And like algae, it can damage architecture, and it can damage these delicately incised stucco drawings. This is something that the Guatemalan government, the site of Tikal, and many other official agencies in Guatemala have not really been able to or have had the interest to clean these rooms. These rooms are still available for people to walk into, and they can document the graffiti. In addition, they can place their own graffiti in these rooms. So these rooms are interesting from the point of view of human experience. If we are going to be looking at sort of the wonderment of human expression, we are going to be seeing graffiti from the 1980s, the 1970s, the 2000s, the 2016, plus we're going to be seeing graffiti from Mahler's era, from the 19th century. So you're seeing people responding and expressing themselves on the walls. For purists, the idea of modern graffiti and ancient graffiti together is a problem because often modern graffiti will overlay and scratch out the ancient graffiti, and we have this very precious view of ancient light or life missing. So I want you to think about preservation with this slide and think about why would we preserve ancient graffiti and not want to preserve today's graffiti? When does today's graffiti become ancient and valuable? This is one of my favorite images, and it comes from Yucatan Peninsula, which is another geographic area very populated by the ancient Maya, just like the jungles of Guatemala. And we're looking at a handprint, which is one of a universal forms of graffiti and forms of human expression. All over the world, we see handprints. And this is a natural way of expressing self, identity, and the fact that you are here. I am here. I'm putting my hand on the wall. And in many examples, we see ancient Maya imagery that is associated with handprints because they are expressing themselves. This may be the graffitist or the artist, and or the artist expressing themselves, maybe like a signature, and they are expressing a lived experience, a witnessed experience. Another example from the Central Acropolis, from the Central Plaza of Tikal that is of a graffiti nature comes from the building directly in front of Temple 1, which is where lintel 3 is located. Temple 1 also has lintels that are decorated and sculpted in the superstructure of the shrine at the very top, but we're not going to look at those. We're going to look at the graffiti. There are no ruler and protector theme graffiti subjects in the superstructure of Temple 2, yet we are looking at some interesting life experience, witnessed events. I want to give you a basic thumbnail sketch of Temple 2's architecture. A photo of Temple 2 is in the upper right-hand corner of your slide. It is a building that is similar to Temple 1, but it is shorter, and it has a less extensive front stairway. It does have a superstructure shrine, and it does have this extensive structure on top of the shrine. And the shrine is composed, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, of a linear arrangement of rooms along a central axis. This central axis is corresponding to the central staircase. Within that central axis, at right angles to this axis, are the lintels. And this is the same general layout that you see for Temple 1's superstructure. The graffiti that we look at in Temple 2 is populated around the entrance to Temple 2's superstructure. And that is basically that area with the yellow square. Now, on the left side of your slide, you will see drawings of this graffiti. And I wanted to kind of just talk about the upper region of this drawing, which is separated from the lower region by a line. This line we can look at and think of it as a ground line. And indeed, we have figures associated with that ground line from the perspective of sort of Western art history. But we also have images of people floating in space. We have hieroglyphic inscriptions floating in space. And we have this large disc in the upper left-hand corner floating in space. So we are looking at typical graffiti imagery that breaks the rules and is doing its own thing. Practicing imagery, looking at imagery that they see. They're not particularly worried about scenes bleeding into other scenes. So we're seeing representations of witnessed events, perhaps, in this upper section, and representations of lived experience by the graffitist or by the artist. One of my favorite depictions in this upper register would be this disc in the upper right-hand corner, which very well may be a sun, it could be a moon, or it could be a decorative element of regalia that was on a pole, but the pole is since missing. So, but we are looking at something that is meaningful to the graffitist. It could be atmospheric or ceremonial. Likewise, the individual on the right side is carrying a spear or some ceremonial object, and he is dressed in kind of casual elite clothing. So be aware that these are intimate images, not necessarily full-on public display. What do you see in the bottom region of this drawing? Do you see lines that kind of radiate out of a central dot? In many ways, to me, this looks like the inside of an umbrella. And the Maya had awnings that could be moved around, that were sort of umbrella-like, that cared for those and prevented them from being in the sun, cared for some elites that didn't want the sun. This could also be, on a very, very natural way, this could be a spider's web. So what we're looking at is maybe a close-up of what the graffitist sees before their eyes, which would be the spider's web. And then in the background, we're seeing a ritual, a ceremony, or just general events in the Great Plaza, or even in a smaller plaza. So this, to me, is illustrative of lived experience. It is perhaps a very exaggerated representation of this quotidian or dailiness of what we see with graffiti. Another example of the dailiness of graffiti, but depicting a very extensive ceremony, comes from the site of Yash Ha, where we are seeing a large kind of landscape image that has several different players within this landscape. At the very top, you see representations of probably buildings, elite buildings that are probably ceremonial temple structures. They have this graduated platform effect. And then in the mid-range, you're seeing several other ground lines that give us the sense of space, organization, and ceremony. In the foreground, you are seeing people wearing elaborate costumes, walking amidst a hill or a ground line and involved in some procession. So be aware that, again, lived experience, but this particular graffitist was interested in space and believable space. Is this one-point perspective? No. This is atmospheric perspective, but they're giving us a sense of space, and that was important to this artist. This artist made the choice to depict a sense of receding space, a sense of believable space. Here in the sacrifice scene from Temple 2, we don't have the same interest in believable space, but yet it is atmospheric space. On the left side, you have a person in a temporary architectural context, perhaps within a large plaza scape, and they seem to be being sacrificed or some kind of event or situation where they are being stabbed or their skin is being pulled from them, some kind of torture or other militaristic public scene that is reminiscent of how you would deal with a very high value prisoner, you might say. And it seems as though there are many other characters surrounding this high-valued prisoner's sacrifice or torture. And they all seem to be looking at this event. Some are looking off in another direction, but we have two figures who are on the right side that have trained their eyes on this event. And then you have a person who is wearing a regalia of a mask, perhaps, that may be administering the torture or the sacrifice to this high-value prisoner. Surrounding this particular scene, which has a ground line, are other vignettes or characters that appear to be floating. But this may also be tying into the idea of atmospheric perspective, where it is not entirely believable space, but it is an atmospheric perspective that shows us a group of people who are coming together to witness an event. That is the end of this brief introduction to graffiti imagery at Tikal and at the surrounding sites of Yaxha and La Blanca. One of the prevailing ideas that I've presented to you would be the idea of lived experiences being depicted in graffiti. The idea of graffiti as a subversive expression. Graffiti as a form of expression that does not necessarily adhere to the rules of public Maya art. Graffiti associated with interior spaces that may have been quiet spaces and spaces where they could hide this subversive imagery. Also, representations of the king, different ways that the king is represented, and how very important size, regalia, and pose is to the official portraits of the king, whereas in graffiti, that's not as important. Also, in this lecture, I have illustrated the sketchiness that is inherent in the graffiti formal depictions. Thank you.